Hello and welcome to Newswatch. In today's programme, the European election has returned a parliament with more power than ever before. Other countries are queuing up to join the European Union, what we used to call the European Community. Austria, Finland, Sweden, Norway and most of Eastern Europe. Later in the programme, we ask, what can the European Union do to help deaf people achieve equal rights?
The best thing we can take from the European Union is new legislation to stop discrimination against disabled and deaf people. I think that would be the best achievement for us from the European Union. And I can see it coming if we work in the right way.
But first, a look beyond Europe at the Central African country of Rwanda. For the past 3 months, it's been impossible to ignore. Television cameras have brought us images of some of the worst bloodletting in decades. The country's president was assassinated in April. Since then, out of a population of 7 million, as many as 500,000 may have been killed, slaughtered by one of two opposing forces. On the government side, the army and other paramilitary groups supporting them belong mainly to the majority Hutu tribe. And advancing from the north, the rebel Rwandan Patriotic Front is drawn mostly from the minority Tutsi tribe. They now control much of the country. As the Hutu are pushed back, they've been killing vast numbers of Tutsi people in their path. Last month, ITN's Mark Austin reported from the town of Nyatama, where up to 100,000 Tutsis were said to have been butchered. As the Rwandan Patriotic Front took control of the town, the survivors returned to the scene of the massacre.
Slowly, nervously, they're drifting home, those lucky enough still to be alive. Home is Nyatama, a Tutsi town once bustling with 130,000 people. Now it's a ghost town. Less than 20%, mainly children, appear to have survived one of the worst massacres of the war. Exact figures may never be known, but Tutsi officials claim up to 100,000 were killed in this area by Hutu militias. The church in Nyatama was no sanctuary. The colourful shawls conceal a grotesque slaughter. More than 500 Tutsis were hacked to death here among the pews. A gruesome testimony to what amounts to attempted genocide, the world's latest display of ethnic cleansing. These people are returning to the burnt-out remnants of a small town that once was home, and to the overpowering stench of death. Many thousands, though, will not be coming back here, fearing the Hutu militias who still haunt the forests. This town of graves is now under the control of the Tutsi rebel army, guarding the hospital where those who survived are treated. Among them, these two sisters, aged 12 and 5. For nearly a week, they played dead among the bodies of their own family.
Stay 7 days with the person who have been killed.
A Belgian professor witnessed the savagery.
They were cut here. They cut also some fingers, you know, not the whole hand, some fingers, just to destroy the people. It's really difficult, you know, as a Western human being, but even as human being, to understand it.
In Nyatama, women and children didn't escape the men with machetes. So what's the future for this little?
This future is very dark, very black, you know.
But many would say that the atrocities in Rwanda are in part a legacy of the colonial past. When European powers carved up Africa between them 100 years ago, they drew up borders without regard to the peoples contained within those borders. The Belgian professor said the butchery was difficult for a Westerner to understand. But perhaps this too is short-sighted. Bosnia is not in Africa, but thousands are being slaughtered there as well. And it's less than 50 years since the whole of Europe was freed from the ultimate in ethnic cleansing. Jews were massacred in synagogues by the Nazis, just as Christians in Rwanda are now being murdered in churches. France is the country which spearheaded the move to send peacekeeping troops into Rwanda. Last month, it celebrated the arrival of Allied forces on its own shores on D-Day 50 years ago. President Mitterrand said, "The Europe that was saved can only now be different." The Queen, with emotion in her voice, summed up the feelings of gratitude of all those who attended the commemoration.
Old adversaries are now reconciled. But the Europe which we know today could not exist had not the tide of war been turned here in Normandy 50 years ago. Veterans of the Normandy campaign, you deserve your nation's thanks.
But reconciled or not, the Germans were noticeably absent from the occasion. The older generation who lived through Nazi rule and D-Day seemed to accept that this was something for the Allies. Younger people were not so convinced it was all right, at least not the way it was done.
Some younger Germans, like these history students, have doubts about celebrating war.
They show themselves as the winners, and I mean, I can understand that they celebrate, but I mean, I'm German, I wouldn't do it like this.
One senior newspaper editor is also skeptical about some politicians' motives.
Particularly in the case of Great Britain, there seems to be an element of escapism. By harking back to the past, you try to avoid having to answer the questions of the present.
3 days later, on June the 9th, there was no escaping the question of the present when elections to the European Parliament began. In Britain, Labour increased its seats from 45 to 62. The Conservatives went down from 32 to 18, and the Liberal Democrats won 2 seats, their first ever. But elsewhere in Europe, socialist parties lost seats and more conservative or right-wing parties gained. So the balance in the European Parliament remains very similar. The Socialists, Greens and others on the left have 243 seats. The European People's Party, which includes the British Conservatives, together with the Democratic Alliance and Far Right, control 184 seats. And Liberals, Independents and others in the centre hold 140 seats, giving a total of 547 seats in a parliament that, after the Maastricht Treaty, will have more power. Most parties see the European Union as a safeguard against the wars and violent divisions of the past. At the same time, some groups want to use membership to increase their political autonomy and even win independence from their present national governments. These include the Scottish and Welsh nationalists, the Basques in Spain, and the Cornish separatist Mebien Kerno. Before the election, News at 10 examined some of their aspirations.
Celtic culture on the fringes of Britain, a long way from the political world of Westminster. Here in Cornwall, many identify more with Brittany than Bristol.
Right, put your hammer.
The Cornish language is passed down the generations, a heritage which the political party Mebien Kerno says can only be preserved by speaking up for Cornwall in Europe.
We feel that Europe has a greater recognition of our problems and the particular characteristics we have, because there are many such areas in Europe with similar problems.
Problems which are all about commerce as well as culture. In the fishing ports of northeast Scotland, the Scottish National Party claims strong support. 1 Euro MP already and hopes of another after June the 9th. The nationalists say the plight of the fishing industry sums up their case.
We're in a situation just now where tiny Luxembourg has got more determination over the Scottish fishing industry as a landlocked tiny country than Scotland, which has 30% of the entire European community's fish stocks. That's a ridiculous situation. We've got no status in Europe just now. We want equality of status with the other nations.
It's a lot more than tartan and tradition. The SNP says the government's simply not in tune with Scottish interests. So while the Scottish nationalists' ultimate goal is an independent parliament here in Edinburgh, free from control by London, they believe they can advance their cause by looking to Brussels. It's a view shared by their Welsh counterparts. At Holyhead Port in North Wales, proof already that a direct line to Europe can bring money and jobs. For years there was no investment here, but now the docks will be modernised thanks to a multi-million-pound euro grant.
We're here on the edge of Europe. We need to get to the marketplace, and European finance will help us do that. It's absolutely crucial, I think, for Wales to have that voice which enables her to go to Europe, to have real influence.
The Welsh as well as the Scottish nationalists are in a group of more than 20 political parties across Europe, working together to win more power for their regions. Called the European Free Alliance, they advocate a decentralised system where decisions aren't just made by member states. One of these regions is the Basque Country in northern Spain. Here they fly their own flag, they've already got their own government and their own police force. But some parties say that's not enough. They want real independence, separation from the rest of Spain. Their candidates demanding a Europe where the smaller players can get on the fast track to Brussels.
We want to build up the political union in Europe, but we want some kind of federation with nations, peoples, not only states.
The Scottish National Party increased their number of seats in the election from 1 to 2. So did the Basques and their regional allies. The Welsh nationalists, Plaid Cymru, failed to win any, though they came second in 2 constituencies. In Cornwall, Mebion Kerno came 7th, with less than 2% of the votes. But if nationalist minorities see Europe as a way of increasing their influence, what about other minorities, such as deaf people? That's the question we'll be looking at in part 2, with 2 deaf vice presidents of European organisations. That's after the break.
By officially recognising the national sign languages, and each country has its own distinctive sign language, the European community will open the doors of opportunity to deaf people in their education, at their work and in their social lives, and will offer new access to information through the media and in their dealings with social welfare, health and other statutory services. Official recognition for sign language offers deaf people the same opportunities and the same access to information that hearing people have long taken for granted.
Those in favour, those against, abstentions, well, that is clearly carried unanimously by this House.
June the 17th, 1988 was probably the most important date in the history of the European Parliament as far as deaf people are concerned. The vote to recommend the recognition of every national sign language. But what's happened since? BSL is still not given the same status as Welsh or Scottish Gaelic, let alone English, and the same is true in most other countries. Last week, Tessa talked to 2 deaf people with a wide knowledge of other countries about how we can make better use of our European connections in future. Terry Riley is Vice President of the ECRS, the European Community Regional Secretariat of the World Federation of the Deaf. Murray Holmes is a Vice President of the World Federation of the Deaf and also a Vice President of Disability Awareness in Action, an organisation through which the WFD campaigns along with a number of disabled groups. It was at the DAA office in London that Tessa talked to them.
What can equal rights campaigners in this country learn from campaigners abroad, especially in the European Union?
I think it's important to learn from other countries, because other countries' deaf organisations and also hearing and disabled organisations, have done a lot of campaigning. I think it's important that we learn from them and share information. It would save us a lot of time working things out for ourselves when others have already done it. It's quicker to learn from them and then get on with things. I feel it's important to have these contacts with other countries.
Through the European Union, are there ways in which experiences and gains made by deaf people in one country can be passed on to those in other countries?
Some examples of how cooperation between countries in Europe can succeed. Take the ECRS. If deaf people want something, they have to go through a deaf association, like the BDA. They can influence the ECRS, the European Deaf Organisation, and its influence has brought gains. Through its lobbying, the European Parliament accepted sign language, and that each country has its own sign language. There was a conference in Athens in Greece, where they had problems in education. The ECRS set up a conference. Lots of people came and put forward resolutions to the European Parliament as well as the Greek government to establish education. Similarly, in Padua, in Italy, there was one on higher education. The same procedure was used, and the government agreed to fund 40 sign language interpreters. Portugal did the same, and having these conferences with resolutions showing the wishes of deaf people in Europe, not just in one country, makes the lobbying more powerful. So it's important to link through the ECRS.
At the moment, we in the UK, say, are campaigning for a law to prevent discrimination against disabled people. We've failed to persuade the British government 11 times now. But if we unite with Europe, the larger the numbers, the more power we can have. If we can persuade the European Parliament to make a law preventing discrimination against disabled people, this can influence our government later on. Because we know Europe is becoming more and more powerful, and there are a lot of laws there that we'll have to accept in the future. So I think it's better campaigning in Europe first. Then the law can be introduced in this country. I think that is a possibility.
In 1988, the European Parliament recommended that all member countries should recognise their indigenous sign languages as official languages. What, if anything, has happened?
That recommendation was a great step forward. It was the first time it was put to the European Parliament, and they accepted it straight away. There were no arguments or objections, none at all. It was approved very quickly. There was just one thing wrong. I was disappointed it was only a recommendation and not a directive. So each government pleases itself. Some are doing something about it, others are not. I'm sad about that. In the UK, the government received it and put it up on the shelf, left it there, not doing anything. I'm disappointed about that. It should have been a directive and it wasn't.
During the 5 years of the last European Parliament, what progress was there on deaf, disability and equal rights issues?
Because there's European funding available, the deaf community have benefited from various projects, such as Horizon. That's helped to set up sign language training, teaching deaf people how to become sign language tutors. There are examples like Bristol University, which has links with Dublin and Portugal. The Helios 2 project covers a wide range, and that's been very positive, not only for deaf people's needs, but also other disabled people working towards a common goal rather than just in small groups as before. There's a lot of European funding, but the problem really is time, finding 50% matching funding from elsewhere to match the European funding. But there have been developments like the BDA setting up the BSLTA. It got help from the European Social Fund. In the last 4 years, there's been a total of 28 European projects for deaf people.
What about the newly elected European Parliament, the new MEPs? How do you think things will develop over the next 5 years?
Well, the newly elected MEPs, the British ones, I think it's important that we have contacts with them. Either deaf individuals or organisations for deaf people. We must have contact, because in future, Europe's going to become very strong. It will make laws which the British government will have to take on board. I feel it's of paramount importance that we make contacts with the new MEPs. If we can persuade and inform them, make them more aware of our problems and other issues, then in turn, they'll support us in Europe.
What's the best thing that deaf people in Britain can do over the next 5 years to take advantage of the European Union?
If deaf people want to achieve the recognition of sign language and civil rights, they have to work together with disabled groups. They can't do it on their own. If we work together, we'll achieve a lot. I think here in the UK there are 55,000 deaf people and about 15 million disabled people. So if you expand that to European level, we're talking about 50 to 100 million disabled people. Together, with the same aim, we could easily achieve what we want.
Terry Riley and Murray Holmes arguing that in the European Union, deaf people need their own political alliances with disabled people and others. Next Saturday, July the 9th, there will be a rally for rights by people with disabilities and deaf people in Trafalgar Square, London, from 11:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m.
And finally, last month, Bob McCulloch won the RNID's Deaf Impact Award for his contribution to the understanding of deaf issues in Northern Ireland through his weekly column in the Belfast Telegraph. He received the award on June the 14th from Sir Robin Day. Bob also made his impact with Newswatch when he appeared on our award-winning programme about Northern Ireland last December. So from us too, congratulations and thank you to Bob McCulloch.
This is the last Newswatch of the present series, but we'll be back in the autumn with more explorations of the issues behind the news.
Next week, Rachel Bastiker will be here with Deaf World and a documentary portrait of the American National Theatre of the Deaf. Don't miss it. Goodbye for now.